Hello and welcome to News Talks, the Times Higher Education podcast in which we discuss the biggest stories in global higher ed. I'm Miranda Prynne, and this week we're turning our attention to Hungary, where right-wing populist leader Viktor Orbán's 16-year rule has come to a decisive end after a landslide victory for Péter Magyar in the country's general election, which saw a record 79.5% of the electorate turn out to vote. This could mark a historic turning point for a country which, under Orbán, has been increasingly allied to Russia and distanced from the EU. Their new centre-right leader, Magyar, has promised to restore relations with Europe and tackle corruption and cronyism, which has run rife under Orbán. But we're here to explore what this means for the country's higher education system. And to help me understand the broader implications of this election for universities, I have the pleasure of speaking to our Times Higher Education Europe reporter, Seher Asif. Hi, Seher. Welcome to News Talks.
Well, Miranda, good to be here.
Now, this is a big topic with plenty to unpack, but generally, populist leaders and higher education are not happy bedfellows. So the broad assumption here will be that Hungary's universities and those working in them are celebrating this election result. Is that fair, or is it more nuanced than that?
Certainly many academics in universities that have resisted some of the changes, including ELTE, which is one of the largest universities in the country, are thrilled by Peter Magyar's sweeping victory. Professors at these universities have had much lower salaries than those that adopted the new reforms under Orbán, and they also faced a lot of professional hardship. I spoke to a professor of political science at ELTE just yesterday, and he said he felt relieved and very emotional at one point when he found out that Magyar had not only won, but he had secured a 2/3 majority, which theoretically allows him to overturn a lot of Orbán's policies. But there will also be, I think, mixed feelings among staff at universities that have adopted the foundation model, which was one of the major reforms introduced by Orbán, and it saw many state universities being transferred out of direct state ownership and into privately governed foundations. And these universities did benefit from increased funding, and salaries went up, and their budget doubled, and sometimes even quadrupled in some cases. So for them, I think the political baggage of the model is real, but so are the material benefits. And there could be some anxiety about what happens to that funding under a new government. And there's also many leaders and board members at foundation-run universities that might be a bit concerned about the outcome, because they might be in a position where they have to sort of defend their record, and the positions depend on these, government structures that have been in place.
Yes, of course. You've mentioned the foundation model, which I'd like to get a bit more detail on, because one of the main concerns over Orbán's impact on Hungary's universities was an erosion of academic freedom and increasing state influence. But his approach to influencing higher education was quite a lot more subtle than just outright censorship. So what mechanisms did he use to reshape the country's higher education system? And the foundation model you've mentioned, can you just explain that in a little more detail and why it was cause for concern when, on the surface of it, moving universities out of state control sounds fairly harmless?
So, Orbán, he essentially turned universities into political battlegrounds during his 16-year rule. He saw universities as spaces that promoted liberal and critical ideas, and he was determined to change that. And one of the key changes he introduced was the foundation model. And basically, with foundation models, on the surface, it may look as though these universities are becoming privatized, and in a sense, they will have more autonomy from the government. But the benefits of being under state control includes having more checks and balances. So a lot of these foundation models, they have a board which is comprised of members handpicked by the government, and initially they were given lifetime positions. So essentially, you have trusted allies that were put into key decision-making roles. And universities weren't, strictly speaking, forced to transition to this new model, but they were encouraged to do so by the government. And this was through increased funding and performance-based contracts.
And how did that affect academic freedom? How were opinions curtailed from being freely expressed through this model?
One of the academics I spoke to who works at a foundation-run university, and he does a lot of research into foundation models. He spoke about smart repression. It's a term that he used to describe it. And he basically said that academics weren't sort of outright told not to research certain things or not to say certain things, but academics who were outspoken or critical in public debates, they often faced more insidious forms of consequences. So there was often sort of backlash against them, and there was also a fear among academics that if they were outspoken or if they did say anything about the board, that there would be sort of financial repercussions and repercussions for their career as well. So it was more sort of insidious, this form of repression described by this academic.
Yes, but you can see how over time that could have a big effect. I mean, it really seems to come down to three key pillars, the way that Orbán influenced higher education, which is appointments of those who were very supportive of his agenda, funding, which is always a powerful weapon to wield, and of course, yes, on a more individual level, the career success of these academics who are striving in a competitive environment. Of course, one of the most symbolic moments in Orbán's relationship with universities was the forced exit from Hungary of the Central European University 8 years ago. Can you talk us through what happened there?
So the Central European University, like you said, became a symbol of the pressures that higher education institutions were facing under Viktor Orbán. It's a university founded by American-Hungarian billionaire George Soros, and it was heavily targeted by Orbán, who saw an institution that embodies liberal values and this internationalist outlook, which he had spent his career opposing. And it was essentially forced out of Hungary 8 years ago after the government introduced this new legislation called Lex CEU that required foreign universities in Hungary to also have a campus in their home country and to also have a bilateral agreement between the Hungarian government and the university's country of origin. So CEU was accredited in the US, even though most of its teaching originally took place in Hungary. And because of this, it was classified as a foreign university by the Hungarian government. And the university did take steps to comply with the new requirements, but Orbán's administration essentially refused to sign an agreement certifying its legal status. And this meant CEU could no longer legally award its US accredited degrees in Hungary. So in 2019, it moved most of its operations to Vienna in Austria. It still has a presence in Budapest, which includes research centers, a library, and some offices, but it can't do any teaching there.
Has there been any reaction from the CEU or Soros on the result? Might the institution ever move back to Hungary?
I did speak to the interim rector of CEU, Carsten Schneider, yesterday, and he confirmed that the university was very much committed to Vienna. It's its new home, and it basically said that moving to Budapest was not on the cards. Any return of full degree teaching to Hungary is currently not on the cards. That was what the rector said. And he emphasized that CEU does still have a presence in Budapest, and it's committed to strengthening that. But its future strictly remains a bi-local one, so that includes Vienna and Budapest.
Okay, so it might develop its presence in Budapest, but it won't be completely relocating. How has all this affected Hungarian universities' relationship with EU higher ed policymakers and university leaders?
Changes under Orbán have had a major effect on Hungarian universities and their relationship with the European Union. I would say the biggest effect has been on access to EU funding. Because of the foundation model, the European Commission decided to suspend EU funds to universities that transitioned to the new model. So these universities were essentially banned from receiving EU funds from Horizon Europe and Erasmus+. And as a result, researchers have had reduced access to international funding and partnerships. A key issue for the EU was the conflict of interest presented by the foundation boards, which included a lot of government-linked figures, which the EU argued undermined institutional autonomy and transparency. So there's essentially just been this breakdown of trust between Hungarian universities and the European Union. I did speak to the rector of Corvinus University, which is one of the major universities in Budapest, and he mentioned how some universities in Europe had been reluctant to enter into exchange agreements or even to begin discussions about Horizon or other collaborative projects. So there's definitely been a reputational damage across Europe as well.
The Orbán administration has defended its record on higher education. It's pointed to improved performance of Hungarian universities in global university rankings in recent years. How much truth is there in this? If we were to carry out a health check of Hungarian higher ed right now, how would its vital signs be looking?
There is some research that suggests that the new foundation model has led to more flexibility, especially compared to the older chancellor model, which was introduced by Orbán as well, under which a rector was responsible for academic affairs, and then you had a chancellor appointed by the government who oversaw financing and things like hiring. And this dual leadership system, I think, it led to a lot of friction. So decision-making was very slow. It was sometimes dysfunctional. And the foundation model is said to have, simplified governance and concentrated power into this one governing body, which is the board. So it's definitely made decision-making quicker. That's what I've heard from supporters of the model. And also there's been some research suggesting that there has been an improvement in efficiency. And secondly, supporters of the model also say that several Hungarian universities have risen in the international rankings. And the introduction of the performance-based funding has also encouraged universities to focus on outcomes that can be measured. So this includes things like publications, graduation rates, and global visibility. So in some sense, they have led to a more results-oriented system. But critics also point out that, it's hard to say what has led to that improvement, and you can't really pin it down on the changes under Orbán, because it could be other factors that have contributed to increased outcomes. And they also say, this performance-based model, it comes with significant trade-offs. So the researcher that I spoke about earlier, who studies foundation models at Hungarian universities, and he said the boards have become small, they've become opaque and self-perpetuating. So there's just this general lack of oversight over the decisions that are made.
And looking ahead, Peter Magyar and his plans as Hungary's leader, what do we know about those in relation to higher education?
Péter Magyar, throughout his campaign, said he would restore ties with the European Union. He said in a press conference yesterday that he is hoping to make a deal with the EU as soon as possible. He didn't mention academia, but I believe a deal could see frozen EU funds unblocked, which could include funding for Erasmus Plus and Horizon Europe. And this would have an immediate impact on universities because it would lead to more research funding and obviously, the full participation in student exchanges. In terms of his broader higher education policies, we don't actually know a lot about his plans. He hasn't announced any sort of details just yet, but he has previously promised to, restore academic freedom in the country, and his broader agenda does focus on reducing political control.
Yeah, so for instance, the foundation model might come under quite close scrutiny, one would assume.
Right.
And what challenges might he face?
The question of challenges is actually, it's very difficult to answer in some sense, because when I was doing research before the election, in the lead up to the election, a lot of the academics I spoke to were quite pessimistic. They said, even if he wins, he is not going to win a 2/3 majority. The likelihood of that is very, very slim. But doing so would give him, sweeping legal powers to overturn a lot of the policies under Orbán. So we're kind of in this territory where I'm not really sure what's going to happen, because in some sense he does have a lot of authority now because he has secured a landslide victory. And it seems like it would make things easier based on what the academics have told me, but I just have a gut feeling that it just won't be as straightforward as it seems. Many universities are, they're controlled by foundation boards that have long-term roles and a lot of independence. So even if the rules change, I wonder if reorganizing these universities could take a longer time.
Yeah, there's no quick fix. You've referenced speaking to academics prior to the election who obviously had expressed concern about whether he could really get the leverage he needed to have a real impact. But obviously we now know he's got this 2/3 majority. Yes, of course, there'll be uphill struggles, no doubt. But what's the feeling now across the Hungarian sector about whether he can deliver on the various promises that he has made so far?
Certainly a lot of optimism. A lot of academics see Magyar's victory as a chance to, reverse or even soften some of the most controversial Orban era reforms, and also restore ties with the EU, which will in turn lead to, access to Horizon and Erasmus Plus funds. But I think there's also a bit of caution and concerns around whether a system created under Orbán, which is deeply entrenched in law and in governance, could change quickly enough. And finally, there's also uncertainty because the election is still very fresh. So we don't really know the specifics of Magyar's higher education policy. So there's a lot to figure out, and there's a lot that remains uncertain at the moment.
Yeah, still a lot of questions. And of course, it has to be remembered that Peter Magyar himself came originally from Orbán's party, although clearly split from that quite a while ago now and has campaigned on a very different agenda. What lessons do you think Orbán's legacy maybe offers for other higher education systems around the world in terms of the impact and influence he was able to have, but also he is out of power now? I just wonder if you feel that for other countries where higher ed feels a bit lambasted, that there might be something to take away from this.
Yeah, I think, Orbán was in power for 16 years. He was Europe's longest serving leader. And during that time, he made sweeping changes to universities. Academics I've spoken to often emphasize that these changes have become deeply entrenched in Hungary to the point where to some extent, it will be difficult, not entirely impossible, but difficult to revert them, even though Magyar has won a 2/3 majority. There is a possibility that reform could be slow because universities under the foundation model, they are governed by these long-term structures that might be difficult to do overnight. And I think the events in Hungary, they really show how quickly changes under this illiberal regime, which is, the words of Orbán himself. He's described it as, his aspirations to create this illiberal regime. And it shows how quickly these changes can be introduced when it comes to governance structures, but also how difficult they can be to unwind once they've become so embedded. Obviously, Magyar, like we said, he needed a 2/3 majority to have the legal powers to even make these changes. And he was able to accomplish that, but it was seen as a near impossible feat before his victory. And at this moment, there's still a lot of uncertainty around higher education in Hungary. So it remains to be seen what will truly change and what will ultimately persist. A lot of academics that I've spoken to, they also mentioned that there is a diversity of opinion among academics in Hungary. I mean, certainly academics in universities that decided not to transition to the foundation model, they are feeling relieved by what has happened, and they're, looking forward to the changes that could potentially come from this election. But there are many universities, 21 Hungarian universities that have been transferred to the foundation-based model. And the sentiment at these universities, it's hard to sort of pin down because a lot of academics, they don't necessarily want to speak openly about how they feel, especially in this moment of time. But I think there definitely is a lot of sort of mixed feelings in Hungarian academia at the moment, because there are academics who benefited from the foundation model when it comes to increased salaries, increased funding, and things like that.
Yeah, and it's maybe interesting to reflect on the fact Trump, in the way that he is approaching or attempting to influence American higher education, has taken a very similar strategy of kind of wielding funding powers. And if you like, of asking universities to trade elements of autonomy in exchange for funding. Now, that's exactly what Orban did. And I wonder if you get a sense from those in Hungary on what they would say if you said, was it worth the trading of the autonomy for the funding, or have those universities that held out against the foundation model, are they now laughing? If there was a message for the American universities being offered Trump's compact, would the message be, oh, go for it, take the funding and accept that you might have to deal with a bit more influence? Or would it be, no, resist, 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 protect your autonomy, eventually the administration will change?
That's an interesting question, because on one hand, universities, they're facing so many funding pressures. I mean, not only in the US, but across the world. That seems to be the overwhelming issue. Whenever I talk to university leaders or professors, they always talk about funding issues. So I can understand why universities would feel compelled to opt into a model like this one in turn to get more funding. But at the same time, it's important to remember that changes that are ultimately made in sort of situations like this, they can be very hard to undo. And that seems to be the message from Hungarian academics, that even though we have a new government, we don't really know whether we can actually reverse these changes and go back to how things were before. But at the same time, Hungarian academia before Orbán was not necessarily in a desirable state either. Academics mentioned that there was persistent underfunding. Universities were not competitive. So it's a very difficult decision to make, I think.
It'll certainly be very interesting to see how things do evolve in Hungary in coming months, and how rapidly Peter Magyar starts enacting his proposed reforms. I'm sure we'll see a fairly rapid recalibration of the country's relationship with the EU, as you say, but as many in Hungarian higher education have warned, it could take a very long time to repair some of the damage done to aspects of Hungarian scholarship under Orbán. Seher, thank you so much for joining me today. I hope to get you back to the News Talk studio soon.
Yeah, thank you so much, Miranda. I had a great time.
Great. And that's it for this week. If you enjoyed the podcast, please do like and subscribe, and we will be back with you in a couple of weeks. Thank you. Bye-bye.